Brethren, in a post in his blog, personal from the president, not too long ago, Mr. Kubrick wrote, many atheists claim that a major reason for their not believing in God is they cannot reconcile how there can be an all-powerful and loving God who is not able to stop war, suffering, and injustice. How can a loving God who created us in his image and likeness not put an end to all the evil? Now, brethren, these kinds of questions, apart from being an attempt to embarrass believers in God with a set of sort of brain teasers, brain busters, which they either couldn't answer or not give a satisfactory answer, is a not too subtle slap in the face to God. Because the end result, whether a non-answer or an unconvincing one, leaves the believer slinking away shamefacedly, and the questioner appearing to have demolished any idea of God. So today, brethren, we want to provide some answers to the question of why does God allow suffering? And why does he not put an end to evil? So you can take that as a title. Why does God allow suffering? Now let's look at some of the arguments that philosophers and other intellectuals have raised that really sought to ridicule the idea of God, as they used circumstances in the world as proof of his non-existence. Let's go way back to the Greek philosopher Epicurus. He lived around between 270 and 341 BC. So this is not a recent thing. He developed an argument that is now called the riddle of Epicurus, or Epicurus's paradox. And he reasoned, if God is willing to prevent evil, but is not able to, then he is not omnipotent. If he is able but not willing, then he is malevolent. He is malevolent, he is wicked. If he is both able and willing, then where do we get evil from? If he is neither able nor willing, then why call him God? And you see the implications of this. If he is neither able nor willing, because evil hasn't stopped, then there's no God. Why do you call him God? So God is a mere fiction that you are harboring here. The 18th century Scottish philosopher, historian, essayist David Hume, he restated Epicurus' riddle slightly differently in his writing Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. And here's what he said. Is he, God, willing to prevent evil but not able? Then is he impotent? Note the question, query. Is he impotent? And the plain implication, he is impotent. He's willing to prevent it, but he can't do it. Then he's impotent. Is he able but not willing? Then is he malevolent? Is he wicked? Is he both able and willing? But if he is, where do we get evil from? Why do we have evil? And these questions are the core of all of the lengthy and complex arguments about the existence of God and why there is suffering. Those presenting the arguments generally infer there is no God, as we just heard David Hume, because that was the end of his argument. Is he both able and willing? But then where do you have evil? Why do you have evil? Because he can't stop it. That is the unsaid and unwritten conclusion. Those who are religious and attempt to give answers, they seek to maintain the goodness of God, but are generally unable to give a satisfactory answer. The result is no one can really say why there is suffering. But let's recognize that these philosophers are merely giving their conception of what they think God should be. They've imagined a God who will respond as they think he should. So you have evil, and then you're impotent, you are omnipotent, you can do everything. You are loving, then if there's evil, then you ought to stop it. But we'll see where that can lead to in a while. Let's look at a few more attempts by highly educated men to provide an explanation to the question of suffering. Let's look at the Russian writer Dostoevsky. In his writing, Notes from the Underground, he says this: man needs only his free will, no matter what it costs and where it leads. That's his philosophy. Man needs free will no matter what it costs and where it leads. This view essentially says mankind must be allowed to do, freedom to do whatever it wants and hang the consequences. It is a view, however, that lends itself to both good and evil. And let's look at one such person who exercised the idea of free will, the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. Now, he was an atheist, and he rejected the idea that there's a divine meaning to one's life. No, he rejected that. So the idea about God making us sons, he rejects that. And that there is a purpose for which each individual is born. So he starts off by rejecting that. He held the view that when the individual does not allow himself to be molded and bound by outside rules and morals, when the individual exercises freedom rather than being determined by the prevailing public tastes and standards, then he is an authentic. He lives an authentic existence. So, no God telling you what you should do and what you shouldn't do. When you decide what you are going to, standards you are going to live by, then you have an authentic existence. He rejected the idea that the world was created for a purpose, or that God is behind its creation. Rejected outright. He and his partner, the writer Simone de Beauvoir, refused to get married, and they lived their lives as libertines. There's a story of the Beauvoir's lesbian relationship with a 16-year-old student. And soon after they began their affair, de Beauvoir introduced the girl to Jean-Paul Sartre. He promptly made it his mission to seduce the girl. And after a romantic entanglement between the three, de Beauvoir told Sartre to end it. And they said he did in a letter. But now you see how Jean-Paul decided to exercise his freedom. Would he have wanted God to step in and stop him? I don't think so. He already rejected any idea of God. Sartre tended to treat younger romantic prospects, all of whom were female, they say, more as conquests rather than partners, spending months or years persuading them to go to bed with him, and then bouncing off to regale the beaver, as she was, Simone de Beauvoir, with details. And Sartre would pay his mistresses rent to ensure they were nearby while trying to keep them ignorant of each other. And de Beauvoir, they said, was sometimes among the deceived, but at other times she was his accomplice in deception. And for her part, her outside relationships appear more amorous and tended to be longer term. She reputedly had an affair with an American novelist with whom she had shared a decade of transatlantic love letters, addressing him as her, quote, beloved husband. She once lived with a French filmmaker somewhere in the 1950s, and they said when it came to her same-sex relationships, she tended to be more exploitative. She once had an affair with a 17-year-old student, which cost her a teaching license, exercising free will. And we've seen that. Now, would they consider this evil? No. A modern philosopher, Ivan Plantinga, in a treatise called Free Will Defense, he says creatures must decide for themselves their behaviors and beliefs. So you and I must decide for ourselves our behavior and beliefs. Therefore, omnipotent, omniscient gods can only create worlds where mortals choose their morals. Fair enough. Plantinga argues that there are some worlds God cannot create. In particular, he, God, cannot do the logically impossible. Therefore, God cannot get rid of much of the evil and suffering in the world without also getting rid of morally significant free will. He will ultimately by giving us His Holy Spirit sometime in the future. But this is a significant point he is making. And Plantinga continues, correctly as we will see later, evil and suffering in the world come from the expression of free will. So Plantinga recognized that evil and suffering is not really due to God. If God were to eliminate freedom, evil and suffering, He'd have to take away your free will. And he correctly concluded that all of the evil and suffering we see in the world come from the expression of free will. The point to note here is that much of the evils are caused by human beings. And this, brethren, is the first reason why God allows suffering. Because He has allowed human beings freedom of choice. And Plantinga correctly understood that evil and its resultant suffering are fundamental to one of God's greatest gifts. That is the gift of free will, or freedom of choice. So the cause of most of the evil that we see and suffering come as a result of human beings having free will and freedom of choice. And let's look at a couple of examples of why that is so. God granted this freedom to the first humans, Adam and Eve, at creation. Here's what He told them in Genesis 2, verses 16 and 17. He said, of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat thereof, you shall surely die. Give them a choice. Don't eat of it, because the day you do, you will die. And they were told what the consequence would be. And what did they do? Naturally, they ate the fruit. And of course, they died. Now, should God have intervened and stopped them from eating the fruit? This is what the philosophers are suggesting. Then He could have been accused of interfering with their freedom of choice, a right that He would have given them. The same freedom to choose was given to ancient Israel. In the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 30 and verse 19, God told Israel, I called heaven, heaven and earth to record this day against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose. And he told them what to choose. Choose life, that both you and your children may live. God promised them extensive blessings if they followed his laws, and an exhaustive list of curses if they didn't. Let's look at some of the blessings. Let's go to Deuteronomy 28. Deuteronomy 28. And let's look. Go from verse 11. It says, and the Lord shall make you plenteous in goods. You shall lend unto many nations, and you shall not borrow. And let's drop down to verse 13. And the Lord shall make you the head, and not the tail. And you shall be above only, and you shall not be beneath. So they will give, this is what I will do. This is what you should choose. But if you choose contrary, here are some of the curses. Let's drop down to verse 16. He told them, cursed shall you be in the city, and cursed shall you be in the field. Verse 17. Cursed shall be thy basket and thy store. Cursed shall be the fruit of thy body, and the fruit of thy land. And in verse 18, he said, you shall plant vineyards and dress them, but shall neither drink of the wine, nor gather the grapes, for worms shall eat them. And let's drop down to verse, let me see here. Let's drop down to verse 41. It says, you shall beget sons and daughters, you shall beget children, but you shall not enjoy them, for they shall go into captivity. And what choice do you think they made? They chose the curses. They chose to disobey God and reap the curses. And this is what human beings have done consistently throughout history. And then when bad things happen, they want to blame God. But God gave the capacity for advanced decision making to human beings only among his earthly creation. He designed us to make choices. Without the freedom to choose, we would be little more than robots, with our behavior either pre-programmed and unchangeable, or dictated in every single detail by an outside force, such as God himself. He would have to be literally on your shoulder everywhere, doing everything and telling you what you should do. So God allows suffering, brethren, because he gives us freedom to choose what we will do. The second reason for suffering is mankind doesn't want God to be involved in its affairs. and Dostoevsky's view that man needs only his free will, no matter what it costs and where it leads, sums up mankind's attitude towards its creator. Stay out of my business. Leave me alone. And again, the ancient nation of Israel provides a perfect example of humans rejecting God. Now, God was king over Israel after he brought them out of slavery in Egypt. But after a while, the Israelites got fed up of God telling them what to do. And they decided they wanted a human king. I suppose they could assassinate him if they don't like what he does and overthrow him whenever. They wanted to exercise their freedom of choice. The prophet Samuel then asked God what to do. And God said, listen to the voice of the people. And everything they say, listen to them. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not rule over them. So they rejected me, listen to them. And God then detailed to them all the evils that this king would do. And we know the story of what happened with Saul within just Saul's lifetime, not 20 years down the line, within Saul's, a few years after Saul was anointed king. God had to replace him with David. But he says, if you anoint a king, here's what he will do. He will take your sons and send them to war to get killed. God had promised to fight their battles for them, but they don't want that. They don't want God fighting for them. They want the king that takes soldiers and send them to war. Okay, you will send your sons to war to get killed. You will take your daughters and make them servants of the state. He will impose heavy taxes on you. He will take your property and give it to his friends. And it sounds pretty much like what we see governments doing today. They just passed $2 trillion in the US taxes. And they're going to pass another one again. So you're going to increase your taxes. But the people said, we don't care. We want a king. Free choice, no matter where it leads. We want a king. Give us a king. So God said, okay. Listen to the people, give them a king. And you can go read what happened in the book of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings. It's an interesting story. So you can go read it and see all of the kings that they had. Now, the response of the ancient Israelites is a kind of laboratory experiment for us today. Human beings in general. Now, human beings, we don't really want God ruling over us, do we? If you were Bernie Madoff, would you have wanted God to step in and stop you with your Ponzi scheme? That allowed you to live in luxury and spend billions of other people's money, while fooling them that you had some magical gift for investing, so that even when everywhere else people couldn't really make much of their investment, you alone had this gift that you could make money for people, even in a recession. So would you have wanted God to step in and stop you? No, because when the authorities came to prosecute him, he resisted. What about the local organizers of the SSD Susu scheme? Would they want God to step in and stop them? No, because they're resisting the government's efforts. We're going to court. But if God says, well, hey, you know, you're violating a lot of things here. First of all, you're not registered as a financial organization. You don't have the expertise in the personnel that you have who can make these financial decisions. You haven't made a payment to the central bank that all financial institutions are required to make. You haven't made those payments, just on that technical basis alone. Plus, there's no way you can make this kind of money and grant people this kind of thing. This is another Ponzi scheme. Would they want God in? No. How about if you were Pablo Escobar with your US $5 billion cocaine empire? Would you have wanted God to stop you selling cocaine? What if you were the Mexican drug cartel kingpin, El Chapo Guzman, alleged former boss of one of the largest and most violent drug cartels in Mexico, with an estimated fortune of US $16 billion? Would you have wanted God to step in and stop you? Stop your life of crime? No, I don't think so. Because when the government attempted to stop you, you went against war against the government, had your own armies fighting and killing police, etc. Had areas that whole neighborhoods you would commandeer and arm people inside of there fighting the police and the army, if you would. But what about war? What if you were Adolf Hitler and the Nazis? Would you have wanted God to step in and stop you from waging war in Europe? Killing around 60 million people in the process, exterminating over 6 million Jews? Would you have wanted God to stop you? Let's imagine you were Adolf Hitler. Would you want anybody to stop you? So, whose decision was it to wage war? Hitler and the Nazis. What about Mao Zedong? What if you were Mao Zedong? Would you have wanted God to stop you from setting up a communist government in China? In your great leap forward, that ended up killing about 40 million people in the process? What if you were Lenin and Stalin, and you were setting up your Soviet-style communist government in Russia, and the other territories that you conquered and called them socialist republics, USSR? Would you have wanted God to step in and stop you from setting up that type of system? Between them, they killed about 60 million people. We know they would not have appreciated God attempting to stop them. And so the second reason, brethren, why God allows suffering is mankind doesn't want God to be involved in their affairs, and God has taken a hands-off position to Israel. Okay, you have rejected me, so let them have what they want. That's what Stalin and Lenin wanted to do. Let them have it. This is what Hitler and the Nazis wanted to do. Let them have it. This is what Mao Zedong wanted to do. Let him do it. A third reason why God allows suffering is there's a powerful spirit being whom the Bible calls Satan, or Satan, as some say, who is bent on destroying human beings. But human beings, paradoxically, choose to follow his ways. The Bible describes him as the God of this world, who deceives the whole world, but who disguises himself as an angel of light. He deceived Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden into disobeying God's command not to eat from the tree. So God told them, don't eat. And he said, no. God knows the day that you do, you won't die. God knows that if you eat from this tree, then you're going to be like God, knowing good and evil. Why did they choose that rather than believe God? They made the choice. So he deceived them into disobeying God, and they went and they ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So the woman saw it was a tree to make her wise, good to the eyes. Now, it's not a literal tree, an apple or anything, but them deciding to make their own decisions, contrary to what God told them. He told them they would die, but they chose to believe the devil who told them, no, you won't die. And they died. Some decisions will produce good results when you decide to do for yourself. But you will also get some bad ones. And this is how it has been throughout human history. Adam and Eve died just as God had warned them. And it will also happen to us if we make the same choices. And so, brethren, a third reason why God allows suffering is that there is this being, powerful spirit being, who the Bible calls Satan, who is bent on destroying human beings, who deceives the whole world. And human beings choose to follow his ways rather than follow God. And God allows that for a while. And we will see later on how long he will allow it for to continue. A fourth reason why God allows suffering is to test us to see if we would choose his ways, and thereby developing righteous character. And let us look at the example of Job. Now, God allowed Satan to afflict Job because there was a flaw in his character, in Job's character. He was self-righteous. Job 32:1 says, after a lengthy debate between Job and a few men, so these three men ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. He was righteous in his own eyes, so they couldn't point out to him where he was going wrong. Job eventually endured all sorts of things, bad things. All his children and his servants got killed. People stole his livestock. He got sick. He had boils all over his body. But when God confronted him personally now, he recognized his flaw. In Job 42 and verse 5 it says, I have heard of thee by the hearing of the air, but now my eye sees you. Wherefore I abhor myself, and repent in dust and ashes. So after he went through all of the suffering, then he recognized, I was really, really wrong. I abhor myself. That is the level of disgust I now have with myself. But before that, he was perfect. He was righteous in his own eyes. And it took suffering for him to then see, I abhor myself, to bring him to that point. So, brethren, God allows suffering to develop righteous character in us. One of the reasons why he allows it. But on the whole argument, the thing is, people want to choose the kind of evils that they want God to intervene and stop. They also want to decide what is evil and what isn't. So if the evil is something they oppose, they want God to stop it. For example, if they decide war is evil, then they want God to intervene. But as I said, what if they were Hitler, who didn't think war was evil? he and the Nazis, some 2 million of them who were in the party, the Nazi party. All of the men in the SS and the Gestapo. Did they think war was evil? No, because they willingly went along with what Hitler was proposing. But there are significant differences, brethren, between what people think is evil and what God considers evil. For example, same-sex marriage. Do people want God to intervene and stop men from marrying men or women marrying women? No, because from country to country around the world we see governments passing laws permitting these marriages. Do people stop in and did they attempt to stop the governments from passing these laws? No. Do they stop the judges from making rulings in the courts that will legalize these relationships? No, they didn't. Now we might say, well, the judiciary is independent and it might be difficult to do that. But if people really want to, they could stop the judges from doing it. They just need to elect a different kind of legislature that would nullify whatever the laws are and make new laws. And change the judiciary if necessary. How about abortion? Do people around the world, generally speaking, want God to stop in and step in and stop the evil of abortion? Instead, what we're seeing is country after country passing liberal laws to have abortions. Not too long ago, Ireland passed such laws. It was restricted before. But there was huge celebrations in Ireland when they passed that law, giving women the right to have abortions. Now, do they think abortion is evil? I suppose not. But does God think it is? How many think abortion is evil? Or do they view it simply as a woman's right to choose what happens to her own body? That's how it is now put. The World Health Organizations, in the statistics, they said between 40 and 50 million babies are aborted every year. World Health Organization, 40 and 50 million babies are aborted every year. Is that evil? Well, recently, the governor of a U.S. state congratulated the lawmakers for passing a bill that authorizes abortions up to 3 weeks before the child is due to be born. That cute little kid you all met last Sabbath, she could have been dead because she was 3 weeks premature. Do you see anything wrong with her today? So the governor of that state would have allowed the mother to kill her if she chose to. Is that evil? Who would make that? Do human beings consider that evil? But they want governments to do this. And the governor got up, and I heard this live. He got up in the assembly and praised lawmakers, congratulated them for passing that bill. That, as he said, here's how he put it. He said after they passed that bill, no one will ever be able to take away a woman's right to determine how to manage her reproductive health in the future. And it was partly a political repartee, because there was the fear that President Trump would appoint judges who would reverse Roe v. Wade that gave women the right to abortion. And this governor got up in the assembly and made that statement, and there was loud applause and desk thumpings and people congratulating themselves and him supporting that. Now, what if God were to step in and try to stop that? Would people appreciate that? No. If he sent somebody to tell the governor that this is evil, and God says so, what do you think would happen to that person? The amount of hate that that person would experience, if not be literally lynched, beaten up and killed, and there would be no remorse for that act. And following the passage of that state's law, a female legislature in another state proposed another law, what she called it, a post-birth abortion bill, that would allow a woman to abort a child up to 3 months after it's born. 3 months after it's born, it's post-birth abortion. So 3 months after the baby's, you decide you don't want it, you can kill it. Is that evil? Remember, the child has already been born. It is a viable human being. But this legislature, this legislator, wanted to give women the right to kill the child up to 3 months after it's born. And call that evil act by the fancy name post-birth abortion. But that would be murder according to God's law. So would God consider that as evil? So you see the difference? People want to define what they think is evil, but not what God accepts as evil. That to God is evil, but people would not want to hear that. What about pornography? It's estimated that the pornographic industry makes between US 10 and $15 billion a year. Conservatively, it's difficult, they say, to get accurate statistics. But if God says the industry is evil, would people want him to step in and stop them from making and selling pornography? And what about looking at porn? Would people want God to intervene and stop them from looking at porn? What about smoking cigarettes and marijuana? What if God decided that these were evil? Would people agree if he stepped in and stopped them from smoking and cultivating these plants, etc.? Or worse, every time a person attempts to smoke, God would step in and douse the cigar or the cigarette or the spliff. Would people like that? And what if, like Jean-Paul Sartre, you wanted to engage in multiple affairs, or as the Bible calls it, fornication, with 16 and 17-year-olds? Would you want God to step in and stop you? Well, clearly in his case, no. He didn't believe in God. And governments have legalized what are now called common law marriages, which, as far as God is concerned, is nothing but fornication, because there is no real marriage contract. Two people merely decide to live together, and if they continue the relationship over an extended period, if there's a parting of ways, then the state says that the woman has rights where property and other financial assets are concerned. And so it will regard the relationship as a marriage, and grant the woman part of the assets to compensate her for her contribution to the relationship over that period of time. But if God were to send someone to the government to tell them what they're doing is wrong, You think the government will listen to what God says? And what has been the result of that? More people have been influenced to follow that lifestyle. And now what we find are high crime rates, non-achievement and poverty among those who choose that way of life. And when the evils are multiplied so greatly that it becomes obvious to everyone that something is wrong, philosophers and atheists ask, why doesn't God intervene and stop the evil? But it was the exercise of free will that Plantinga talked about that caused the evil, not God. Brethren, there are consequences for actions. There's cause and effect. There are spiritual laws that govern human relationships. And if we break these laws, the Bible says, you will reap what you sow. You get good results if you do what is right, and negative results if you don't do what is right. Otherwise, there'd be no point in having a law. God allowed Satan to suffering, brethren, results from us making our own decisions and ignoring the laws of God. God gave humans the free will and the capacity to choose, but He tells us to choose the ways He directs, not the ways that we want to go. He allows us to experience suffering so we can learn that we need His guidance, that we do not have the capacity to foresee all of the consequences of our choices. Suffering helps to build character in us. And God wants us to develop righteous character because He has a tremendous plan for human beings. That is making us into sons of God, into being like Him. So God won't allow suffering to go on forever. One day He will intervene in human affairs and set up a government that will rule the whole earth. And then He will impose His ways, isolate the devil so he can't influence human beings anymore, and so end suffering once and for all. And despite the fact that Jean-Paul Sartre didn't want to deny any such thing existed, God has an awesome promise that He made to us. We were created to share an inheritance with Christ in the kingdom of God, contrary to what Jean-Paul Sartre said. The awesome promise of this shared inheritance involves us becoming sons in God's eternal family, just like Christ is a son of God. And let's go and read this in Romans chapter 8. Just to impress it. Romans chapter 8. And let's go from verse 14. And here's what he says. For as many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God. For you have not received the spirit of bondage again to fear, but you have received the spirit of adoption, or the spirit of sonship, whereby we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit itself bears witness with our spirit that we are the children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ. But Jean-Paul Sartre rejected that. God didn't have any purpose. There's no God in the first place. And there is no purpose to human life beyond what we decide to do. But here's what it says. God is making us heirs with Christ. heir of all things. If so be that we suffer with him. Note, if we suffer, suffering helps us to get to that point, brethren, that we may also be glorified together. And here again, for I reckon that the sufferings of this present time, again, note Paul, suffering is part of life that God has allowed to happen to bring us to this point. So that as Paul could say, I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. So even as Paul was experiencing sufferings, he was comparing it with what would be down the road, what the result of the sufferings would produce. For the earnest expectation of the creation waits for the manifestation of the sons of God. For the creation was made subject to vanity, not willingly, but by reason of him who has subjected the same in hope. Because the creation itself also shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption. The planets and everything else out there that is suffering will be delivered from that. It says the deserts will bloom. Desert is an example of the land suffering. It is suffering from a lack of water. It is suffering from a lack of the trees and plants and flowers, etc. And you have a wasteland. The earth is suffering from that. From the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation, as he said, the whole creation groans and travails in pain together until now. And I look from time to time at the images that they beam back from the rovers that they sent recently on Mars, and you see a barren landscape, not even a blade of grass, totally barren. And as he says it here, it is in bondage to corruption. Mars cannot free itself from that. No rain falls on Mars. There are no plants there, no animals there, nothing. All you see is sand and rock. That's all there is that you see. And in other places, you may see what looks like snow. But there is nothing living there, no life. But he's saying here, the creation shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. We are going to get eternal life. And life is going to be put on planets out there. And not only they, but ourselves also, which have the first fruits of the Spirit. Even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting for the adoption, waiting for the birth, to be born, to wit the redemption of our bodies. And at that time, brethren, God will end all evils and suffering, because His Spirit is going to be in us. And that Spirit will guide us into making decisions that He approves. Note what the Bible says of the future in Isaiah 2 and verse 1. It says, "And he shall judge among the nations, and shall rebuke many people. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." And war is perhaps the major cause of suffering in the world around us. And note Isaiah 11, verse 9. He said, "They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain. For the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea." So although He allows suffering and evil, brethren, this is not God's intent. He has different expectations. Because he has a much higher purpose for us that John Paul Sartre didn't know of and died never knowing. He was just limited to whatever he felt like doing with these tawdry relationships that we mentioned. And in this higher purpose that God has for us, he wants us to choose to obey him from the heart, to enthusiastically love and cherish his values and standards, which are based upon two overarching principles. Loving him with all of our heart, and loving others as much as we love ourselves. And he also predicts the future, when he will put his spirit into human beings. That will completely change the types of choices that they make previously. Instead, it will result in them choosing his righteous ways completely and eschewing their evil ways. So going in a manner different from what Jean-Paul Sartre would have approved. And as Plantinga said, God cannot logically create a world. Yes, he can. But he isn't going to do it by standing over your shoulder and every time you attempt to do something wrong, slaps you upside the head, as they say. He's going to put his spirit within you that you will naturally choose, not automatically. You're not a robot. He will put his spirit within you that will influence you to choose this way, because you've also seen the consequences of what was done before and you want to go a different way. So it will result in human beings choosing his righteous ways completely and eschewing their evil ways. Or as a famous broadcaster used to put it, choosing the give way as opposed to the get way. The give way is God's way. That produces peace. The get way is our way and Satan's way, and it produces suffering and evils. And so, brethren, as we go through this life, let us choose the give way that produces good and righteousness.